Good evening to all of you. Welcome to the rabbis, community leaders, the Orthodox Union National Leadership, Alan Fagan, Marty Nachemson, Rabbi Weil, and the others who are here, the Orthodox Union West Coast leadership, Rabbi Kalinsky, Rabbi Posey, and the entire Orthodox Union team, all the Rabbanim and leaders. It's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this keynote opening to the Orthodox Union West Coast Convention 2015. Our shul, Beth Jacob, is thrilled to have the opportunity to host this evening, and I want to recognize our shul president, Jess, and his wife, Michelle Dolgan, and Beth Jacob, first vice president, and also Orthodox Union West Coast president, Steve, and his wife, Linda Tabak. Thank them for their great leadership. Look, I think everyone here knows that the Orthodox Union, nationally, internationally, speaking more locally here on the West Coast, in the West Coast and region, under the outstanding leadership of my good friend Rabbi Kalinsky. So the Orthodox Union has played an invaluable role in strengthening Torah and shaping the life and the future of the American Jewish community. And the challenges, you don't need me to tell you, are profound here in the States, in Israel, in Europe. External threats, internal divisions, and now more than ever, we have to leverage our communal strength, our resources, our brain power, which includes all of you here in the room, and all our power to really be successful. And one of the great messages of Hanukkah, which we're going to be observing starting Sunday night. It's 8 days this year. So one of the great messages of Hanukkah is that that little oil lasted for a long period of time, and that the small Jewish army was able to defeat the larger and stronger, in technical terms, Syrian Greek army. And the messages that Hanukkah teaches us is that the Jewish people are never governed by statistics. Even if the odds may be against us, we're able not just to survive, but also to thrive. But we're only able to do that if we work together, if we have faith, commitment to tradition. We're proud Jews, we're fully committed to the tradition, but also when we work together, when we join together like we're doing this evening under the auspices of the OU, and we think boldly and creatively about how we have to confront those challenges. And that's really a major central role of the Orthodox Union, which is to bring the United States, a community, Jewish community, together and to light a candle in a dark world, teaching and inspiring adults and youth, much of which we're aware of, but a lot which goes on behind the scenes and we're not really aware of the amazing work that the OU does in so many ways, but also challenging us to imagine what we can accomplish if we set our minds to it together. Now, the theme of the convention, and I want to get quickly to our speaker because that's what you came for, is leadership, and which really includes all of us, and certainly our political, communal, and religious leadership. Let me perhaps touch on the theme with a joke that many of you have heard, but perhaps you haven't heard the lesson that I recently heard, which I think is a very insightful lesson, about the rabbi who's walking past the non-kosher restaurant, and he sees Moshe, who was eating in the restaurant. So many of you have heard this, and the rabbi can't believe it. He waits till Moshe leaves the restaurant. He says, Moshe, you were the gabbai for 37 years. We studied Daf Yomi together for 43 years. You're a leader in the community, and it's hard to believe that you're sitting here in this non-kosher restaurant. So Moshe says, Rabbi, you saw me order the food? He said, yeah, I saw you order. Did you see me eat the food? Yes, I saw you eat the food. Did you see me pay for the food? Yes, I saw the whole thing, the rabbi says. And so Moshe says, so Rabbi, what's the problem? It was under complete rabbinic supervision. It wasn't under OU kashrut supervision, but it was complete rabbinic supervision. And perhaps the lesson is that sometimes rabbis engage too much in rabbinical supervision. When the rabbis and community leaders have to be thinking about not supervision, but providing a vision or a supervision for the community. And so really that's what we're going to be thinking about over the course of the weekend. Not just supervising and making pronouncements, but how we can work together, leveraging our respect for one another and the different perspectives and resources we have to provide a vision for our future, for the Jewish future. So it's a privilege to welcome back for this theme of leadership and providing a vision. Welcome back to the OU Convention, welcome back to Beth Jacob, Michael Medved. Okay, Michael is one of the leading and most influential political and social commentators in America today. Throughout his career, an Orthodox Jew, throughout his career, he has been a leading voice for values-based leadership. And best-selling author, radio talk show personality, whose show reaches over 3.5 million listeners on nearly 200 stations across the country. He's someone who is thoughtful, he's traveled the country, he's been thinking about issues, he understands our Jewish community, and so that's why it's such a great pleasure. Great to see you, Michael, and hear you that you're back in action, better than ever, and it's really a pleasure. Without further ado, to welcome and introduce Michael Medved.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be back at Beth Jacob, and thank you, Rabbi Top, and thank you, Rabbi Kalinsky, for all of your work, wherever Rabbi Kalinsky is. He's probably working somewhere right now. There he is. And Sandy, and for all of the other distinguished Rebbeim and scholars and Balabotim, so many of whom I know for a long time, and it's wonderful to see everybody. And in terms of the introduction, I'm put in mind of a way that Lyndon Johnson, who was in many ways not an admirable leader, but he did have a way with words. He got a particularly lavish introduction at one point when he was Senate Majority Leader before he became Vice President and then President. And he said, that was a wonderful introduction. That was a great introduction. And you know, I only wish that my late parents were here to hear it, because my papa would have enjoyed it, and my mama would have believed it. And that is always an appropriate response that highlights some gender differences. And speaking of gender differences, I mean, one of the things that happens in our polling and our selections is people classify everything according to gender and ethnicity and income and education level. But you know what? There is one proposition in which there is astonishing unanimity among the American people. Astonishing unanimity. And you know what it is? People of every walk of life, of liberals and conservatives and moderates, independents, Republicans, Democrats, East, West, North, South, everybody agrees our leadership in this country stinks. I see an easy applause line. You know, I mean, you talk about it, look at the approval rating for leaders in various institutions. It is pathetic in the United States. It is pathetic in the United States. Right now, the President of the United States, who was elected twice, he won majorities of the popular vote twice. The President of the United States has historically low approval ratings, even for him. And yet he is a burning pyre of popularity compared to the Congress. I checked recently. I checked a couple of days ago. Do you know what the approval rating is for members of Congress? How many people think Congress is doing a good job, approve of the job Congress is doing? It's 12%. Now, John McCain says when you're down at 12%, that's pretty much paid staff and blood relatives. They're the only people who approve of what is going on with Congress. It's an astonishing thing. 3/4 of Americans, according to typical polls, and there are different polls about this, think the country is headed in the wrong direction. For the first time ever, an overwhelming majority of Americans, more than 60%, say that they agree with the statement, the American dream is dead. We talk about the theme is leadership for challenging times. I saw that's the official, I think, title for the theme of the whole OU convention. And it's an appropriate title. I saw coming in that my topic was not leadership for challenging times, it was leadership for troubling times. And maybe more appropriate, I mean, especially considering the events very close by to here. Today on the radio, and I broadcast today from Glendale, from KRLA, which by the way, for people who haven't discovered KRLA, you can give this station, AM 870, a little bit of love. 12 uninterrupted hours of broadcasting by Jewish guys who take Judaism somewhat seriously, at least. I mean, beginning with the wonderful Ben Shapiro at 6 a.m., 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., Dennis Prager from 9 a.m. to noon, me from noon to 3, and then Mark Levin, who I always worry about Mark's health, but Mark from 3 to 6. You know, for a Christian-owned company, this is a lot of Yidden. In fact, it's a garden of Yidden. And I was at the station today, and we were talking about this. Somebody joked, said, yeah, we're thinking of changing the call letters from KRLA to KJEW. But that probably, we have not won any awards at the station from the Council on American Islamic Relations. Okay, with that in mind, let me frame this question about the kind of leadership that we need and what is so lacking in American leadership at the moment. Let me frame the question by asking a question about Yiddishkeit. And it's something that I was actually thinking about on the plane on the way down here. We flew down here on Wednesday morning and broadcast from KRLA on Wednesday, and we're going to be broadcasting again tomorrow, and then back here for Shabbos for this whole wonderful convention, which I wouldn't miss even if I weren't speaking. But in any event, what I was thinking about was this. The most important events next to the OU convention in Jewish life really are weddings, because weddings secure the Jewish future. And what is absolutely necessary at a wedding? Well, you need a chassan, you need a kala, you need a bride and a groom, you need a mesader kedushin, you need somebody to be in charge, but even that is sort of fungible. You need shnei edim. You need 2 kosher witnesses, right? And how do you define a kosher witness at a wedding? And the edim play a crucially important job. Name is on the kesuva. The edim have to be shomer Shabbat. Okay, this is an interesting question. The gentleman in Rabbi Top's story who was eating under rabbinic supervision, as long as he's shomer Shabbos, presumably he can be an aid. And meanwhile, somebody who may go to daily minyan every single day, who may be learning daf yomi, who is a bal tzedakah, who is a wonderful Jew, but drives to shul on Shabbos, he can't be an aid. Why that standard? Why is that standard so crucial to the crucial role of edus, of witnessing, in a Jewish wedding? Okay, to help answer that question, let's take a look at the key missing perspective in American political and cultural life today. And that missing element in our perspective is perspective. We tend not to have any accurate vision of who we are, of where we are going. Americans seem to be stumbling around in the dark with a total lack of perspective. What do I mean? This is something that comes up on the radio from time to time, and I'm sure some of you have heard it. Is people will call in and they will evince the typical sentiments that you hear today. This is the worst time in American history. America's never had such a terrible crisis. The American dream is dead. Things are miserable. Everyone is suffering. The country is just a spot away from doomsday. Dr. Ben Carson, who's kind of a friend of mine, he even, by the way, gives me credit, and I'm very proud. You can ask me about this in the question period. Dr. Carson gives me credit for getting him to Yale, where he was as an undergraduate. And I'm flattered by that because I think Dr. Carson's a great guy. But Dr. Carson says repeatedly in the course of his campaign that America is deeply similar to Nazi Germany. You know, unfortunately, there are a lot of people here who may have personal experience or certainly have family experience with Nazi Germany. America is many things. We are not similar to Nazi Germany. It's a sickening comparison. It's invidious. It's wrong. It's wrong-headed. And no one who is running for the nation's highest office should ever compare the United States of America to the Third Reich. What is this stupidity? Why do people take it seriously? Why do so many people in America feel that the nation is worse than it's ever been before? By what measure? This is what I would ask people. What's so terrible about life in America? I mean, seriously, look, I bring to this a unique perspective because I'm a cancer survivor. My diagnosis for stage 3 throat cancer was, I'm 4 days away from our 1-year anniversary of diagnosis. And thank you, everybody has asked, and by the way, thank you to people who said Misha Barachs and Tefillot in my honor and in my behalf. It worked. I feel great. I feel terrific. And yes, I believe that I did have siyata d'shemaya and I did have help in this regard. But you know what? I also had the best medical care system in the world behind me. I got the kind of medical care that would have been possible to get anywhere else, or that someone could certainly not have gotten even in this country 25 years ago. Does anyone doubt that the medical care available to you right now in the USA is the best anywhere at any time? And yes, Eretz Yisrael has terrific medical care too. Now, it's phenomenal. The standard of living that we have. You know, here's an interesting figure, and this is one of those things in LA with the flourishing of kosher restaurants. In LA and in Oxnard. I mean, who would think that Oxnard, California would be home to a world-class, world-famous kosher restaurant? Pretty good wines, too. Look, this flourishing may actually equalize something that has been different between religious Jewish people and the rest of the population. Do you know that the average American in 2014, which is the most recent year for which the Labor Department has figures available, the average American spends more money today eating out than on medical care? The notion that Americans are suffering, it's absurd. Today I had a caller who was saying that you could understand why this evil person killed 14 people and wounded 17 others in San Bernardino because he was so oppressed. What's oppressed, for God's sake? Really, this is a guy who was born in Chicago. He's educated, courtesy of the taxpayers of California, at California State University, San Bernardino. He's working at a government job, and the exact figure for his compensation in 2013, most recent year for which it's available, $72,230 a year, which is pretty good for a 28-year-old. We have a son who's looking for a job right now. And, you know, he's only 23, but listen, that's what's oppressed. Honestly, in the question period, I would be glad to take your answers. What is terrible about America? People are upset about things like these shootings. The crime rate, the violent crime rate, is the lowest it has ever been measured, ever, since they've had statistics. The murder rate in New York City is lower than it was measured in 1870. Okay, do you know what that means? Do you know how many, literally, hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved from being shattered by the fact that our murder rate in this country, with all the shootings, with all the stuff you read about, how much we have saved in terms of suffering and death and blood and horror because we've done a better job with policing and on our criminal justice system? How many black lives, which do matter, how many of those lives have been saved? And by the way, if you look at Eretz Yisrael, people who say that things are so terrible in the world, if you look at Israel, we were just talking about this at the table. It used to be, people would say, how can you make Aliyah? It's such a tough life. used to have to wait, how many years? We have some Israelis here. In the 1970s, could you get a telephone right away in your home? No! People had to wait for years to get a phone. My parents, alav shalom, tried to make Aliyah in 1949. And it was simply too hard for them. But today, the standard of living, my father finally made Aliyah and lived the last 19 years of his life in Yerushalayim. But the standard of living in Israel is phenomenal. It's comparable, if you look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD figures, Israel is bunched right next to the United Kingdom in terms of the standard of living. Can you imagine? And by the way, way ahead of Scotland and Wales. Okay, you may say that's not saying much. All right, no anti-Welsh or Scottish sentiment here. Look, the truth of the matter is that in recent years, far from this being the worst time in human history, do you know that people estimate UN figures, and they have no reason to lie on this, about 2 billion human beings have moved away from abject poverty into what is generally construed as middle-class life. 2 billion. A lot of them in China and India, the two most populous countries in the world. China and India together have 3 billion people in them. And if you look at the change in living standards, the lack of starvation, the opportunities, it's extraordinary. So why are we so upset? Why are we so negative? I want to give you 3 reasons and then come back to answering the question about Eidim and Shabbat. 3 reasons why we are all so upset and miserable. Number 1 has to do with a focus on disaster. Number 2 has to do with a separation from human contact. And number 3 has to do with an absence of memory. Okay, a lot of this stuff has to do with what we spend most of our time on in our lives today in America. And here, again, this is something that the Labor Department compiles statistics on. In a lifetime, other than sleeping, they measure how people spend their lives. Most people will spend most of their lives sleeping. That's the biggest chunk of time. And you can figure that out. If you're sleeping 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's more than you work, and you don't retire from sleeping, at least we hope not. And you begin sleeping even before kids begin competing to get into their competitive nursery school so they can have a little leg up to getting into Harvard or Yale. Okay, sleeping, big effort. What do we spend more of our time on than anything except sleeping? Answer is TV. And today it's not just TV. Today it's TV and video games and the internet and screens. There was a recent study that I covered on the air from the American Academy of Pediatrics that today an average teenager in the United States spends how many hours a day in front of a screen, either a little screen that they carry with them, or a big computer screen, or a TV screen, or some kind of screen? It's 9 hours a day. It's bizarre. We are giving over the bulk of our lives to these flickering images. Sometimes they're words. Sometimes there's interesting stuff on the internet. It's a wonderful tool. I mean, I'm in the middle, my wife and I are both in the middle of writing books right now. And the internet is a tremendous help to that process, no doubt about it. But think about what it means. The point about this is the world of screens, the world of media. And boy, did I see this yesterday, broadcasting here from KRLA. We do not have a news business in the United States. We don't. We have the bad news business. If something terrible happens, if an evil Islamic fanatic comes into a Christmas party, and it's unbelievable, they had someone on CBS News who was saying, well, perhaps calling it a Christmas party was a trigger for this young man. It's unbelievable. I played the segment twice. You couldn't believe it. And then people saying, well, these were government employees. It must have been some anti-government right-wing militia. It wasn't. It was an Islamic extremist. But he comes in, he kills these people. The suffering is unimaginable. Imagine that you're one of those families that has lost someone under these circumstances, or you're somebody who has a wound that may impact you for the rest of your life. This is an unbelievable thing. And yet it is a huge news story. It crowds out everything else. The saying in local news, and everyone knows this, if it bleeds, it leads. If there's an accident, if there's destruction, if there's a fire, if there's a misery, weather never makes a big story. When weather is beautiful, as I understand it is here in Southern California a lot of the time, if the weather is beautiful, it never makes news. Never. If there's a storm and trees are down and power is out, if there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's something miserable, that's news. And by the way, the same thing goes with the state of the environment. When I was talking about things being better than ever before, in Los Angeles, the numbers are staggering. We had a real smog problem in this city in 1955. That was about the worst. It is vastly better. The air quality, the water quality, even the LA River, right, is making little tiny bits of improvement and maybe more to come. But for goodness sake, what is so terrible? What is so terrible is the focus on negativity. Leo Tolstoy said in Anna Karenina, the first sentence is, happy families are all happy in the same way. Unhappy families are each unhappy in compelling and fascinating ways. That's why most of our stories on TV and movies, in the newspaper, everywhere, the stories that people like to hear are not about happy families. They're not about happiness. They're not about achievement. They're not about good news. They're not about cancer recovery. They're about death. They're about destruction. They're about negativity, which is why most Americans don't know that crime has gone down. Most Americans don't know that our living standards have gone up. You ought to experience it. How many people here in this room have grandparents, or let's say even great-grandparents, who were significantly worse off than you are? Okay? I would assume just about everybody. Just about every, and that's not unique to Jews. That's true of everyone in the United States of America. Do you know, I looked it up recently, and this is something I was speaking at a wonderful, wonderful event for NCSY last night, which was absolutely inspiring. And to see the growth of NCSY, which is reaching so many young people with a substantive Torah message and substantive energy for Yiddishkeit. One of the things I cited to them is that in 1969, when I graduated from college, 5% of Americans had undergraduate four-year college degrees. Is that amazing? 5%? And by the way, it was about 2% of women. Because there were a lot of schools. When I went to Yale, there were no women undergraduates. No women undergraduates at Princeton or Dartmouth. In any event, today, what percentage of Americans have undergraduate college degrees, four-year degrees? About 30%. It's shocking. The majority of Americans who graduate from high school go on to a community college or to a four-year college. And it's now a small majority of black Americans. But why don't we know that? Because the focus is on negativity, and most of us get our impressions directly from mass media, which cover negativity and deny you, in general, access to the good news, which is all around us. It's a tremendous problem. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, and they've done studies on this. George Gerbner, may he rest in peace, at the University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School, did all of these studies on people's attitudes toward the world around them. And there is a direct linear correlation between the number of hours of television that people watched and their negative view of the world. The people who were most optimistic around the world around them were the people without TV. And by the way, there's a guy named Brandon Centerwall at the medical school at University of Washington who did studies in Canada. Canada got TV late, particularly in some of the provinces that aren't Quebec and Ontario, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. There are whole areas that got TV late. And one of the changes as soon as TV came in, and Dr. Centerwall measured this, was that people became more negative about their surroundings. They got a worse impression. Why? Because it's all about dysfunction. It's all about marital breakdown. It's all about infidelity. It's all about difficulty. It's all about problems. Which brings me to the second reason that people have no perspective on where we are and how fortunate we are, and how to continue good fortune rather than to deny it. And that has to do with our isolation from human contact. One of the things about American life that you can say is vastly different from the past is we don't have time for other people. And again, here, all of these studies about the way that Americans spend their time, the studies are appalling. Do you know what time, how many hours a day a typical husband and wife spend speaking to one another? And believe it or not, the Labor Department does measure this. Typical American husband and wife, any guesses? 30 minutes, 2 hours. 10 minutes, you're awfully close. They say about 15 minutes a day. And you know what? The chances are they aren't substantive conversations. They're probably conversations about who's going to pick up the kids, where's the laundry, honey, can you find my keys? Why are women better at finding keys than men? There must be a Torah reason for it. I don't understand. In any event, look, we don't have time to talk to our spouses, let alone to our neighbors, let alone to other members of the family. When you think about the 9 hours a day that children spend in front of screens, and the 10 minutes a day, officially, that they spend talking to their parents, you really think as a parent you can influence your child successfully without a commitment of time together? This is a huge American problem. Most people in this country know contestants on reality TV. They know fictional characters in Game of Thrones or Empire. They know people like that better than they know the people who live next door. The sense of community in this country that used to be the country's great strength, and this is one of the reasons that people are so unhappy, is despite our material blessings, with 2 career families, and now most American homes, in most American homes, both husband and wife work. Sometimes the wife works part-time, sometimes the husband works part-time, sometimes the husband doesn't work at all. But with the additional hours working, with the commitment we all make to email, to checking our favorite websites, to television, we don't connect with other people. One of the most important books, I think, of recent years is a book by Robert Putnam, who just retired from teaching sociology at Harvard. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And what's the chiddush in Bowling Alone? It's this. He remembered growing up in the Midwest in the 1950s. And bowling was a very big deal. Different organizations had bowling nights. And you'd come out with a league, you'd come out with people, and everybody would be... And he was fascinated because he checked and he saw that the statistics indicated that just as many Americans bowl today as bowled in the 1950s. Amazing. There might even be some people here who bowl. But you know what? People today bowl alone. The bowling leagues are gone. The bowling leagues are part of what he called at one time the great American animal organizations. Lions, elk, moose, Kiwanis, whatever they are. And Rotary isn't an animal, but it's the same idea. But these organizations used to be a big deal. And I'm sure we all have uncles or grandparents or others, sometimes parents, for whom these organizations were meaningful. B'nai B'rith lodges used to be a big deal. Today, most people are exhausted. They come home. They give themselves to the screen, either TV or computer, and that's it. Now, what does this have to do with people being depressed? Absolutely everything. Because the truth of the matter is, it also explains this anomaly, which so many sociologists, including Robert Putnam, have commented on. When you ask Americans about the state of the country, they are universally negative. And yet, when you ask them about their own situation, they're almost universally positive. Most Americans are negative about the country, but positive about their own prospects and family. The most striking thing about this is they did this survey 2 years ago, and they asked people, how would you describe the state of your marriage? For the people who are married, and most American adults are married. The majority of American adults are still married. They're not married with children, necessarily, but still married. And they asked married adults, would you rate your marriage as very happy, happy, somewhat happy, not so happy, or not at all happy? 81% rated their marriages as very happy. And you may ask, well, then why do we have a 70% divorce rate? We don't. We don't have a 50% divorce rate. This is one of those big lies that I've written about a lot. And by the way, I would love to sign some books for you later tonight. But it's something I've written about a lot. There is zero statistical evidence that we have a 50% divorce rate or ever did, and the divorce rate has been going down in this country. So why are people, they're happy in their own marriages, but you ask them, what's the state of marriage in America? Most people think, well, marriage, that's just for gay people and Catholic priests. It's not the only people who want to get married. No, it's not true. Most people get married, and statistically, and the Census Bureau can confirm this, somebody who's getting married in his first marriage for both the husband and wife, they have a 70% of remaining married until one of them dies. People don't know it. Why not? Because of the isolation from other people. People know their own lives. And for instance, people, you ask them about your doctor, my medical care, most Americans think the world of their doctors. You ask them about doctors in general, puh. The medical care system is broken. Either Obama ruined it or Obama was unable to save it. But people seem to be very upset with the medical care system, but their own medical care, terrific. You ask people about the schools. American education, terrible. Have you ever spoken to someone who says, you know, I send my child to a public school or a private school or a yeshiva or a religious school. School I send them to is terrible. You will occasionally meet people like it, very rarely. Very rarely. Most Americans have great confidence in their own children's schools, but everybody else's schools stink. Dr. Putnam writes about this. He says it's the I'm okay, you're not syndrome. And what is this based on? The fact that in your own life, the stuff that you do, the stuff that you see, the stuff that you experience, you know it because you live it. And you realize how great you have it. But the other stuff, you don't know other people. You don't interact with other people. We're not members of community. We're isolated. So what do they base it all on? News bulletins. They base it all on this bad news media immersion that we were talking about before. And that brings me to the final point, which is the absence of memory. One of the problems with a media-driven culture is it is by its very nature impatient. And here again, Dr. Gerbner at University of Pennsylvania did this very interesting study where he analyzed television, which of course is such an important part of American people's lives, and just the amount of time that a typical camera angle would be held on screen. And it's one of those things, if you go home and you watch TV and you look at it, you'll notice the difference immediately. In the 1950s, in the days of I Love Lucy and Sid Caesar's show, they would hold a given shot for an average of 54 seconds. Today on TV, they hold a given shot for an average of about 6 seconds. Everything is quick, 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 quick. On MTV, it's even quicker. On Sesame Street, it's even quicker. And what it makes is for impatience. Everything is about impatience. Everything is about the immediate. It's why you hear idiot things all the time. This is the worst economic disaster in American history. It was unpleasant. It was miserable. You know what? Even though the market had another terrible day today, and I know it did, and I'm sorry for that, this is the worst economic disaster in American history. Do you know how long the market was down during the Great Depression? And then right again in 1937, 38, they had another big fallback. 1893, we had an unemployment rate in that Great Depression, which many people consider worse than the Depression of 1929, 1931. In 1893, we had 35% unemployment. And that was at a time when you did not have two-career households, where people literally could starve. Okay, the reason that people say the stupid stuff that they do, this is the worst this, it's the worst that, the weather is the worst climactic disaster, is the worst earthquake ever. I remember this so vividly. Do you remember the Loma Prieta quake in San Francisco? When it was considered, somehow it was God's punishment for the fact that they had the Oakland A's versus the San Francisco Giants in the World Series. So during the World Series, they had this earthquake. And I remember some of the coverage, and I was concerned. My brother Ben lives in San Francisco area. So some of the coverage was, the devastation is awful. It's unimaginable. And there were 50 people who died. It was a serious quake. But you know, the worst earthquake in American history? Are you kidding me? Compared to the first San Francisco earthquake in 1906? Why does this stuff happen? The worst this, the most serious that, the bloodiest this, the worst. Because people have no memory. People don't know history. That's why older people, those of us who remember, in other words, one of the things that gets me angry, I got significantly angry at all of the people, and there were literally millions of them. George W. Bush was the worst president in American history. Doesn't look so bad now, does he? Okay, but that was stupid. It was pathetic. Especially when one could argue that his actions in rescuing the economy when it was teetering the banking system and in significant trouble, I think will historically be remembered as somewhat heroic. Bush wasn't the worst president in American history, and you know what? I mean, I hate to say it, and don't throw anything, please. Obama's not the worst president in American history either. And no, he isn't. Conservatives are wrong to say so. And you should remember Jimmy Carter, just by way of reference, okay? Carter was worse, and even more self-righteous. Even more self-righteous. And by the way, Franklin Pierce was considerably worse, and James Buchanan was considerably worse, and John Tyler was arguably much worse. You know, we've had unsuccessful presidents. And do I believe that, look, I am not a Barack Obama fan. I spend a lot of my time on the radio talking about not being a Barack Obama fan. But you need to have perspective. And the perspective is history will look back on his administration as something of a mix. I think his personal leadership and his personal quirks, like the instinct every time there's a shooting to go back to this gun control mantra, it's like the old days when the doctor used to take that rubber mallet and hit your knee, and you kick, and instead of kicking the knee, Obama says, we need more gun control, we need more gun control, we need whatever the problem is. That's the answer, that's the reflex, that's the instinct. Okay, I'm not a fan of that. However, we need to get a grip. And by the way, for people who talk about the terrible, terrible events in Israel, with the stabbings and shootings that have killed 19 Israelis, which is terrible, including an American who was there doing his gap year, as our children have done in Eretz Israel. Ezra Schwartz, his memory should be a blessing, from Sharon, Massachusetts, who was murdered for being a Jew. Well, by the way, he was in the midst of an errand delivering supplies and candy to soldiers. Okay, it's terrible. Israelis, however, have a better memory. It's not the worst it's ever been. It's not close. perspective is necessary. Perspective that takes us away from the focus on disaster and the bad news. Perspective that takes us away from the isolation where you don't know other people, so you only know the phantoms that you see on TV screens. And a perspective that takes you from looking at the immediate moment without reference to the past and what's happened before. So how does that connect with the question that I asked at the beginning? The way to adopt perspective for Jewish people is clear. And perspective is the most important quality for leadership. A perspective that sees our place in a continuum of time, a perspective that sees our place in a wider world, a perspective that sees not just the problems, but the blessings. All of that comes from Shabbat. And all of those aspects that I talked about that force a lack of perspective are answered by Shabbat and intended to be provided as an answer by Shabbat. In terms of the focus on the bad news, part of what we do on Shabbat is emphasize the good news. It's why we bless our children. It's why we say Eshes Chayil, woman of valor, why we honor the wife in the home. It's why you save all of the things that are there for Zachoret Yom HaShabbat, for remembering the Sabbath, for keeping the Sabbath, the positive things, the finest wine. Maybe not as fine as at that NCSY event the other night, but really fine wine, and as fine as the wine we had tonight, which was wonderful. Finest wines, finest foods, best tablecloths, table settings. The joy of Shabbat. Because one of the two things that we honor on Shabbat, what are we remembering? Zecher Maaseh Bereshit. This, we are remembering the acts of creation, that God created this world, and He didn't create it for somebody else. He created it for you. He created it for us. And by the way, it's good for Jews to remember every once in a while that God didn't create all the beautiful things in the world just for Goyim. Right? He didn't create all the beautiful things in the world just for non-religious Jews. He created it for us to enjoy and to recognize and to look at the positive and to count our blessings and to be thankful and to enjoy the beautiful experience of walking to shul, even in the rain in Seattle, even in the heat in Los Angeles, and in the reduced smog. And on the other aspect, the isolation of people from community. The whole idea of Shabbat is to build community, to talk to other people. All of a sudden, think what a gift it is, what a gift it would be to every American to turn off the computer, to turn off the email, to turn off the text messages, no telephone, no television, no video games, even no radio, the ultimate sacrifice, for 25 hours a week. What a gift. You can hear the voices of real people who are more compelling than the characters on the screen. Shabbat is set up. That's why we have Shabbat guests. That's why Orchim are so important. Shabbat is set up to connect us with the other people, to see the lives of real people around us, and not to hold our lives up only in the perspective of phantoms on some kind of a screen. And on the final point, the idea of taking our place in history, the absence of memory, which afflicts people today. Shabbat is about memory. It's not only about Zecher Maaseh Bereshit, it's not only remembering the deeds of creation, it's also Zecher Letzias Mitzrayim. It's also remembering the deliverance from Egypt. Remembering the liberty that we have, the joy that we have, the freedom that we have. And we are ultimately freed because there are those things that have to do with malacha, that have to do with creative work that we don't do. The idea of remembering and recognizing blessings and connecting with other people. What does all this have to do with weddings and perspective? Absolutely everything. Because Shabbat provides perspective. And perspective is the key area for a leader. And what is a witness? A witness is a leader. By the way, you'll notice it's traditional also to have a minyan at a wedding, right? The minyan doesn't have to be Shomer Shabbat, but someone with a leading role, someone who is an aide, who is a witness, he has to be Shomer Shabbat. He has to have perspective. And it's one of the reasons that in the Torah scroll, when they write out the Shema, and you probably know this, that the last letter of the word Shema, the ayin, is written larger. And the last letter of Echad, written larger. Why is that? All of the Meforshim say it's so that the ayin and the dalet together spell aid. They spell witness. That's what we are supposed to be doing when we say Kriya Shema. We are witnessing. Witnessing perspective. And that kind of witness, that kind of perspective, the kind of perspective that we're going to enjoy together starting tomorrow night at this convention. See, a lot of other people are talking about Hanukkah. We have Shabbat first. Even more important. And that kind of perspective is the kind of perspective that we need as Jews, that we need as Americans, that the American people are crying for, and maybe even able to begin to achieve again. A perspective that is worthy of this greatest nation on God's green earth. Let me open it up to a few questions before we join tonight. Any questions, comments, kvetches? Yes, sir.
Michael, I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
I had a thought. You mentioned something about most Americans, I hope I don't get too much trouble for saying this, but most Americans seem to know what did you call them? The haunted players on the other side of the screen.
The phantoms, yeah.
Phantoms. Do you think that might explain why the current leader of the polls for the Republican Party is as popular as he is?
You mean Hagadol Hagaon? Of course it does. Of course it does. Look, this is one of those things. Nate Silver, who's a very clever person. I mean, one thing, you can take away anything about Nate Silver's perspective, but his accuracy as a pollster and a student of public opinion. In the election of 2012, he called the outcome of every state election correctly. That's remarkable, including Senate elections. He called it 100%. And one of the things he says is that right now, a real measure in the Republican race is about 80% undecided. And of the people who have decided, it's true, the greatest group are for Trump, probably about 5%, as opposed to the 80%. But a lot of that has to do because they know who he is, and he's running a reality show. It's compelling, it's dramatic. And do I believe that when the American people actually start getting serious and thinking about their children, and when the debates fold down, the other thing that Silver says, and I think he's entirely correct, is that Trump gets regularly about 25% of Republican votes. Everybody else gets less. But that's 25% of 25%, because only about 25% of Americans describe themselves as Republicans. They're only polling Republicans. They don't poll independents. Trump's disapproval ratings, a majority of Republicans disapprove of him, and overwhelming majorities of independents and Democrats. So what you're talking about is 8%, maybe 9% absolute tops of Americans who really, really, really like Donald Trump. Probably not enough that will make him the nominee. Though I do suspect that he will be around until the convention for one very simple reason. This year is different in primary terms. And again, your news media haven't been telling you about this enough. I've been trying to emphasize it on the air. You just have to look at the rules, actually read those boring rules of all of these primaries. 60% of the delegates are going to be handed out proportionally. What that means is that if you're Donald Trump and you get 25% of the delegates someplace, you get 25% of the delegates. But it also means if you're Chris Christie and you get 10% of the delegates someplace, in most states, that means you get 10% of the delegates. What that means is that there will likely be a bunch of candidates, more than 3, who make it to the convention with some delegates who are legally obligated to vote for them unless they've dropped out of the race and released their delegates. So we may have, for the first Republican convention since 1948, the first convention for either time since 1952, a convention that goes more than one ballot. And because you have to win a majority of the delegates, and if there really are 3 or 4 or 5 candidates who last to the convention and come into the convention with delegates, no one will have a majority on that first ballot. Do I think that's likely? I think it's possible. I would say the likelihood of going more than one ballot is almost 50-50. So it will be very, very interesting. We'll talk about this later. We have some political panels. Yes?
I'm really happy to see how strong your voice is and how long you're doing.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to ask you, who would you like to see as the next president?
Who would I like to see as the next president? Someone who isn't Barack Obama, and someone who isn't Hillary Clinton, and someone who isn't Donald Trump. Sorry, I don't know if there are some Trumpniks who are here. There probably are, but no. Look, I think we have a number of good candidates, but of the serious candidates, and I've been pretty open about this on the air, I think the one with the best chance of winning and the best chance of being a truly, truly successful president, Senator Rubio, is probably the... Well, good. I see this side of the audience is... in any event, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the characteristics of being a successful president is the ability to work with other people, including people who disagree with you. You may have noticed since Obama lost control of the House of Representatives in 2010, his administration has accomplished just about dead flat nothing except for negativity. All of his, quote, legislative achievements were when he had a Democratic Congress. Successful presidents, great presidents, are able to work with other people. They are not polarizing. They're not divisive. There's a great story about FDR, who, with all of his failings, he was undoubtedly a great president and a greatly successful president. And after he failed with this court packing scheme that he came up with in 1937, he initiated, his aides didn't have to persuade him, he initiated a meeting with top members of the Senate to apologize. And he came in, they had drinks together as they did at the time, smoked a few, he smoked cigarettes, the other smoked cigars, and they were backslapping. And he said, well, I'm really, really happy that you've listened to me. I guess sometimes I'm just my own worst enemy. And Senator Kerr of Oklahoma raised his hand. He said, not while I'm alive, Mr. President. But the ability to do, it's inconceivable that Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, for that matter, could have that kind of ability to work with people with whom you disagree. And by the way, for Republicans, this is a very big deal. If you have spent all your time running for the nomination, calling your opponents sick puppies and child molesters, or rhinos, or people who favor amnesty, or people who aren't true conservatives, if you have been attacking, how do you expect those people to turn around and support you enthusiastically? The idea of Reagan's 11th commandment of don't attack your fellow Republicans has to do with self-preservation. You're going to need those people, because otherwise you're not going to get elected. Okay, let me take just a couple more questions. Yes, sir?
Would you care to address the issue of Islamic anti-Semitism? There was a Messianic Jew who was among the victims in San Bernardino,
I know,
who was involved in an argument about Israel with the murderer. And I'm wondering, it's a subject that has been taboo to address other faiths, but are we at the point now where the Jewish, and not just Orthodox, but the conservative reform ought to be addressing Islamic anti-Semitism?
We should have been addressing it a long time ago and not bought this idea that because it is absolutely true that in the Middle Ages, The Islamic authorities, for instance, in Spain, were not as violently and virulently and murderously anti-Semitic as the Catholic authorities who took over from them in 1492. That's true. That's 500 years ago. Okay? The era of warm Jewish-Muslim cooperation, which, by the way, has been greatly oversold. You just have to read Bernard Lewis or Ayan Hirsi Ali or anybody who's an expert on Islam. It's been greatly oversold. It's true. It's true. The Catholic Church once upon a time, not true today, thank God, but the Catholic Church once upon a time was bitterly, chronically, deeply, internally anti-Semitic. So was the Russian Orthodox Church. So was the Eastern Orthodox Church. Protestants, it's different a little bit. But again, the consistent hostility of Islam to Judaism in particular is profound. There's a scholar named Ian Lustig who writes, and I think it's a very good explanation. There is a very powerful hadith that most religious Muslims know that predict that because the Jews in Medina rejected Muhammad and his mission, that they would be sentenced forevermore never to have a country of their own. That was their curse. So the mere existence of a Jewish country, the mere existence of Jewish land on Jewish land that was supposed to be forever and forever and forever part of the Ummah, part of the Muslim world, that is a rebuke to a belief in some aspect of Islamic tradition. And by the way, concerning this poor gentleman who was killed, I think this is one of those things that people should be aware of in confronting Messianic, so-called Messianic Judaism too. I'm very, very sorry. He sounds like a very nice man. He was a pastor. His name was, I think it was Nicholas Thalanikis. Sounds very much like a Greek name. A very, very high percentage, I think some studies suggest a majority of the members of so-called Messianic congregations are not ethnically Jewish. They are not people of Jewish ancestry. They are people who are fascinated by this. They like blowing shofars. They like wearing those talesim. They like the traditions. Now, am I denying the fact that he may have been targeted because he was perceived as Jewish and he was very pro-Israel, like most Messianic Jews are? No, he may have, and I am sorry he died. Very sorry he died. But I think this is one of those awkward moments where you have to be careful about claiming him too much into the center of Jewish life. Because I don't want to be in a position where we're recognizing, let's see, we have Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Humanist, and Messianic Jews. If you're a follower of you-know-who, you're a Christian. Okay, last question.
Yes. I think personally Mr. President Obama is encouraging the terror organization by not participating in destroying.
She says she thinks President Obama is encouraging the terror organizations by not participating in destroying them. I basically agree with you. I would say it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but let me just do that, and then I want to conclude with a quick personal note. I think I had a caller today on the radio who made a very good point, which is that the Islamic world, the way that people view things, and this was very, very much true of Osama bin Laden, Yamak Shamo, was they're looking for winners. They're looking for the strong horse. They're great evidence that Muhammad is a prophet and a sacred prophet and had a singular understanding of God, is the fact that they won all these battles in the 7th century and in the 8th century and 9th century. They were on a big winning streak. What a proof to them. Right now, they look upon the world and they see America in retreat. They see an America that's paralyzed. They see a Europe that John Irving has described Europe as a rouged and made-up corpse in a very fancy coffin. And it's a terrible thought. God forbid that should be the case. But you can understand that when people all around the world, is something that really has bothered me. Do you remember that they did that thing, they did it on CNN again and again and again and again? That kid in France, in Paris, with the father explaining, the kid said, they're bad people. I'm scared of them. He said, don't be scared. He said, I'm scared of them. They have guns. And the father said, don't worry. They have guns, but we have flowers. Sorry, flowers don't do it. You know, I mean, really, Islamic stone-cold murdering fanatics are not going to be influenced by flowers or good wishes or by President Obama's yearly Nowruz greeting to the Iranian people. I mean, the whole thing is pathetic. Strength and power are important. That, by the way, is, I think, part of the appeal of Donald Trump. Now, again, it's so unfocused and it's so purely visceral, but still this idea that America, by every measure, we are the most powerful nation in the world. We ought to act like it. And a world without American leadership is a world without leadership, period. And leadership is important and perspective is essential to good leadership. Let me just add one more thing about my personal perspective. I do love being here. I love and appreciate all of your good wishes. I am sure, 100% sure, I'm not the only cancer survivor in the room tonight. But there is something about the experience of being very sick and being in the hospital for weeks. My wife, who's here, thank God, will tell you part of the reason that I was able to come through all of this is the most wonderful wife and children and new daughter-in-law. And again, God has a sense of humor. Our new daughter-in-law, they got married in August. I was diagnosed in December, is an oncology nurse. And she was at my bedside and helping me. And, you know, it was so wonderful. And then the outpouring from people around the country and people who actually cared about getting my voice back on the air. I was gone for 11 weeks. It was really too wonderful. And I feel so grateful. I feel grateful every morning. I feel grateful that I'm able to get up and do the job. And by the way, in the very lovely introduction, we now have 300 affiliated stations, actually 318 at the moment, and including all kinds of news stations, and that's exciting and that's wonderful. But one of the things that I hope I will never lose is that sense that you get after you're sick of every day being a gift. And I think that's the lesson that we're meant to learn on Shabbat, that we're meant to learn at this wonderful OU convention. Why? Because, look, the Jewish people, I think Rabbi Heschel said the Jewish people aren't the ever-living people, they're the ever-dying people. It wasn't just Look magazine that the rabbi referred to. It's Rabbi Weil referred to. It's so many people predicted the demise of the Jewish people. Here we are, in Beverly Hills, California. It's an amazing thing. And you know what? We should celebrate every day because we are all survivors. And may we continue with that consciousness and with that gratitude. Am Yisrael Chai. Shabbat Shalom. See you all over Shabbat.